The story opened with a voice resounding through the void, echoing as it cried out the name Murimyong. The protagonist was kneeling upon the ground. At first he had believed the voice descended from the heavens themselves. From that moment onward, a single command had been bestowed upon him. He was to protect that child. That alone was to be his purpose for living. The order had come from Cheon Wui Gang, the head of the heavenly clan. Murimyong remembered gazing at the boy who stood hiding behind Cheon, and he had reflected that this child, the first son Cheon Muriang, was to become his reason for existence. At the time he had not known that this very boy would one day become the absolute disgrace that would bring ruin upon the heavenly clan. Murimyong had bowed deeply and declared that he would follow his lord's command without fail. 15 years later the clan had passed away without warning. In the aftermath, Muriang's degeneracy only deepened. The clan's influence, once ranked among the top 10, withered almost overnight. Members and allies began to abandon the heavenly clan one by one. Yet Murimyong remained. He stayed steadfastly at Muriang's side, devoting his life as the young master's bodyguard. He was always shielding the man who in truth behaved like nothing more than a coward. Then on a rain-soaked day, two figures appeared at the front gate. Before Murimyong could react, Muriang plunged a sword into his back. He was overcome with absolute shock at Muriang's betrayal. Collapsing onto the ground, he could think only one bitter thought: was this blade the sole recompense for his unwavering devotion? Meanwhile, Muriang trembled and wept in fear. Fatally wounded, Murimyong fell to his knees, strength draining from his body. A hollow realization surfaced in his mind that broken people could not be mended. As his vision blurred, he saw a mysterious group and their masters drawing nearer. The hooded figures advanced toward him. Muriang looked at them in pure desperation, appearing terrified and pleading as though burdened by some unforgivable sin. The red-hooded men ignored his words and unsheathed their swords. Even on the brink of death, Murimyong attempted to resist. With the final remnants of strength he possessed, he tried to grasp a blade and defend himself. In that fleeting moment, he turned his gaze toward Muriang and wondered whether the young master had truly believed they would spare him after offering up his head. Had he genuinely thought the demon cult would restore the clan he himself had destroyed? Had he truly believed betrayal was the path to survival? With unrestrained fury, Murimyong declared that Muriang had been wrong. A thunderclap split the sky, illuminating a new horror. The mysterious figures were revealed to be members of the demon cult. One of them possessed eyes and a mouth that sealed shut in the most grotesque manner imaginable. Another wore a demonic mask and carried souvenirs taken from his victims. At the sight of them, Muriang trembled in terror. Murimyong reflected that if Muriang had wished to live, he should never have involved such monsters. At that moment, an old man raised a massive weapon intending to strike down the young master. Muriang attempted to flee, but the blow had already begun its descent. The enormous blade crashed down instantly, obliterating the traitor. Watching the scene unfold, Murimyong felt only hollow regret. He concluded that from the very beginning, he should never have served the first son. Agonizing upon the ground, he silently questioned his former master, wondering if he was watching. The first son had not been worth protecting. He bitterly admitted that he should have abandoned that trash long ago. With no strength left to resist, Murimyong let the sword fall from his hand and dropped fully to his knees. He lifted his vacant gaze toward the rain-drenched sky as the demon cult members approached. Blame was meaningless now. Only regret remained. He remembered that he had originally possessed no name. After being taken in by the head of the heavenly clan, he had been called Murimyong, a name meaning nameless. Now staring at the sky, he accepted his fate. If granted another life, he hoped he would bear a name of his own. As the cultists struck him down, he harbored one final wish: that he would never again be born as himself. Thus the nameless man died. Yet even after everything, he felt an intense chill. He fleetingly thought that death was a cold thing. When he opened his eyes, however, he found himself in an entirely different place. A girl was washing his feet. He sprang up in alarm, startling her so violently that she fell backward. Confusion overwhelmed him. He realized he was alive despite being certain his body had been riddled with blades. Before he could gather his thoughts, the kneeling girl began apologizing profusely, stating that she had not realized the water had grown cold and that she would immediately heat it again. Recognizing her, Murimyong asked whether she was Wolyong. He recalled that she had once been the personal maid who served the first son since childhood, the one constantly abused by him. Wolyong begged for forgiveness, pleading that the young master find it in his heart to pardon her. To her astonishment, he told her it was fine and instructed her to forget it. Then he asked why she was calling him young master, and more importantly, where the first son Cheon Muriang was. Wolyong, visibly surprised, informed him that he himself was the young master Cheon Muriang. In utter disbelief, Murimyong touched his face frantically. He rushed to the water basin and saw Muriang's reflection staring back at him. He recoiled in horror, wondering what madness had occurred. Later that night, seated alone in his chamber, he reflected deeply. After repeatedly confirming his circumstances, he concluded that this was no dream. Somehow he had returned 15 years into the past within the body of the first son. he recalled asking Wooliang earlier whether anyone named Mumiang existed within the clan. To his astonishment, she had stated she had never heard such a name. He realized then that by becoming Cheon Mu Riang Mumiang had ceased to exist. Opening the window, he contemplated that perhaps this was an opportunity, a chance to protect the heavenly clan with his own hands. The method did not yet matter, he would determine that as he proceeded. He had time. The clan would not fall for another 15 years, as he surveyed the room. However, a new irritation arose. He questioned why the first son's chamber was so pitiful, scarcely larger than a trainee's quarters. His gaze then settled upon a sword bathed in blue light. The sight triggered the memory of the moment when the young master had stabbed him with that very blade. It was the heavenly light sword, the legendary weapon said to have been forged from a solitary ray of light piercing the darkness, a treasure bestowed solely upon the first son of the heavenly clan. Holding the sword in both hands, he wondered whether that meant the heavenly light sword now belonged to him. Excitement surged through him, quickening his heartbeat. Drawing the blade, he studied his reflection in its surface. Determination ignited within his eyes. He concluded that the sword was on an entirely different level from any weapon he had wielded before. He began testing it within the confines of his chamber. Yet the young master's heavy, untrained body could not keep pace with the rhythm of his movements. After only a few swings, he was utterly exhausted. Weakness overwhelmed him, and he collapsed to the ground, unable to move. He was shocked to realize that his breathing and muscles had already reached their limits from such minimal exertion. Later that night, beneath the full moon, he resolved to investigate the root of the problem. Sitting cross-legged, he entered meditation. Even if Mu Riang had neglected his training, he reasoned that he should at least be capable of wielding a sword a few times. Normally, internal energy was cultivated within the dantian and flowed through the meridians. Yet as he analyzed Mu Riang's body, he detected something deeply abnormal. A massive quantity of energy was trapped within the dantian, unable to circulate into the meridians. Worse still, the conflicting energies clashed violently, damaging both the meridians and the dantian. Strained and contemplative, he concluded that this resembled the classic conditions suffered by wealthy heirs who overdosed on rare elixirs, a golden spoon, chi deviation. The following day at the training grounds, several clan members practiced with wooden swords. One youth was struck sharply upon the head and erupted in fury, accusing his opponent of recklessness and demanding to know why he had aimed for the head with full force during a spar. He insisted he had heard something crack and threatened retaliation if such aggression continued. The victor mocked him, telling him to stop acting timid and reminding him that he had promised victory with one hand. He demanded payment for the lost bet and proposed higher stakes if the other remained dissatisfied. As the fallen youth grumbled that the round did not count, the victor's attention shifted. He spotted the first son training with a wooden sword. Shocked, he questioned whether that truly was the first son and remarked that it was the first time he had ever seen him on the training grounds. Another scoffed, wondering what that trash was doing there. Meanwhile, Mumiang was internally aghast. His body could scarcely manage even a wooden sword. Setting it aside, he acknowledged that swordsmanship was impossible in such condition. When someone taunted him for giving up so quickly, he resolved upon a new priority: he would run. Losing excess weight was essential. He began running around the training grounds with unwavering determination. The onlookers observed him with disdain and confusion. Some noted that he showed no intention of leaving. One bully, wearing a sinister smile, declared that he would ensure the young master regretted ever stepping onto the training grounds. While running, Mumiang was utterly exhausted, sweat pouring down his face, as his breath came in ragged bursts. As he continued sprinting despite the strain, he thought that this situation was far worse than he had anticipated. At present, Cheon Muriang's body was in complete disarray due to the countless elixirs that had been forcefully administered to him since childhood. Those numerous elixirs were now clashing violently within his system, their incompatible energies turning toxic. Agitated, Mumiang reflected that the fool Muriang, had he devoted even a fraction of sincere effort to his martial training, would have possessed internal energy capable of inspiring envy in anyone. He concluded that the first priority was to condition this body into a state capable of properly absorbing and refining that energy. Only after stabilizing it could he even begin to consider learning the Cheon clan's secret arts. Before he could pursue that train of thought any further, a sword suddenly sliced past his face, narrowly missing him and catching him completely off guard. The force of the impact sent the weapon spinning through the air before it embedded itself into the wall. Staring at it, Mumiang registered that it was no practice weapon but a real sword. As he turned his head, he saw the same bully standing there with a smug smile. The man offered a mock apology, claiming that his hand had slipped during the spar. Behind him, his companion burst into laughter, clearly entertained by the spectacle. The expression on the assailant's face made it obvious that the entire incident had been deliberate. Mumiang glared at them, inwardly cursing them as wretched bastards. The bullies gathered together. one of them remarking in a tone dripping with false concern that the place was more dangerous than it appeared. Another added that the young master might get hurt by accident and suggested that it would be wiser for him to remain confined to his room as he usually did, observing their behavior. Mumyong realized that this was the true state of affairs. The bully with the supercilious smile gazed at him contemptuously and thought that the fat pig had only his parents to thank for his status. He questioned how someone so worthless dared to crawl into that space. He further assumed that after such a warning the young master would scurry back to his quarters in humiliation. Instead, Mumyong offered a feigned apology accompanied by a faintly smug grin. He thanked them for their supposed concern and stated that he would indeed be careful. Immediately afterward, he resumed running as though nothing had occurred. The surrounding apprentices erupted into laughter, teasing their leader and asking what was happening. Noting that the pig master was actually enduring it, others remarked with surprise that he was truly staying. They collected the wager money from the bully and with their winnings in hand decided to go out drinking to celebrate their effortless profit. However, the bully leader remained behind with a grimacing expression. He muttered inwardly about that fat bastard Cheon Muriang. Meanwhile, Mumyong continued running without pause. He reflected that these warriors were openly looking down on their own master, a disgraceful state of affairs. Nevertheless, he resolved to endure it, acknowledging that if a fight broke out he would unquestionably lose. Someone of his experience could determine that merely by observation. He reassured himself that it was acceptable for now. The Cheon clan's secret arts, which he had longed to study in his previous life, should be housed within the Heavenly Dragon Library. With determination burning in his eyes, he reasoned that as the first son Cheon Muriang, he should unquestionably possess the authority to enter the library. Upon arriving at the Heavenly Dragon Library, he encountered a guard stationed at the entrance with visible irritation. Mumyong asked the guard to repeat what he had just said. The gruff guard stared at him in silence, gripping his spear before reiterating that Muriang, the young lord of the Cheon clan, had been stripped of his title, and therefore entry into the Heavenly Dragon Library was denied. The guards physically barred his path. Defeated and powerless to contest the decision, Mumyong turned away and left. Returning to his small room, he sat heavily upon his bed, exhausted from the events of the day. Alone in that confined space, he realized that the reason for the room's modest size now made sense. Stripped of the young patriarch title, he wore a gloomy expression as he contemplated that since he had intended to find a method within the library to rapidly absorb the elixir energy, he would now have to devise an alternative approach. Raising his head, he reflected that Muriang's childhood had not been smooth either. Memories surfaced of a body ruined by elixir side effects, surrounded only by enemies and subordinates who mocked their master. On top of that, Muriang had been a loner much like himself. He wondered whether that isolation had driven him to his disastrous choices. Perhaps Muriang had believed he had no one on his side. Perhaps he had even thought that Mumyong, his escort warrior, was an enemy. Clenching his fist, Mumyong rejected those thoughts, declaring internally that he did not need such excuses. With a furious expression, he concluded that Muriang had brought in the demonic cult, and as a result the Cheon clan had been annihilated. That was the unvarnished truth. The absence of allies had been the natural consequence of Muriang's own behavior. Mumyong reflected that he too had been a loner, but only because he had been wholly absorbed in martial arts training. Noticing a food box beside him, he opened the lid and wondered whether Wolyong had prepared it. Seeing that it contained mushrooms, he remarked inwardly that she could at least have included some meat, as it was bland as he ate. He questioned how Muriang had managed to become so fat on such simple meals. Still, he acknowledged that there had been one person. Muriang had possessed a single ally. The next morning, Mumyong rose early to train in the backyard. He marveled at what kind of body could become overwhelmed by something as simple as a warm-up. At that moment, Wolyong entered and observed that he was already awake. She asked whether he intended to train again that day. Mumyong responded affirmatively, though somewhat awkwardly. She wished him a good day as she was. Moving from there, he asked whether the bundle she carried was his laundry. Frightened, Wolyong apologized, explaining that she had intended to wash it sooner, but had waited for him, so she could complete the task before sleeping, only to doze off instead. Mumyong regarded her with a faint smile and thought that she did not appear capable of being much help, yet she was his only ally nonetheless. Approaching her, he caused her to flinch in surprise. Placing his hand gently upon her shoulder, he thanked her for her hard work. Wolyong was stunned by the sudden change in his demeanor and asked what he meant. He apologized and then requested that she work a little harder for him, mentioning that there would likely be much more laundry for a while after he departed. Wolyong remained standing there, blushing and unable to comprehend the abrupt transformation in her young master. Night eventually fell, yet Mumyong did not cease his relentless training. He ran through the mansion courtyard without pause, drenched in sweat, pushing himself to lose weight. He was so exhausted that he felt as though he might die. Memories of his past training resurfaced, his instructor screaming at him, demanding to know where he thought he was striking and whether he had completely lost his senses. The instructor had mocked him for wanting to attend the New Year's festival, calling him an ungrateful rascal despite being fed and clothed. He had ordered Mumyong to perform the Know Your Place downward strike 100 times as punishment. Young Mumyong had accepted the discipline in silence. Meanwhile, he had seen young Muriang joyfully urging his father to hurry so they would not miss the lantern parade, the acrobatics, and the fireworks. Left alone, Mumyong had wondered whether he had ever made a single decision for himself. There had been no choice. He had wielded the sword solely to repay the grace of the patriarch who had taken in a nameless orphan. Returning to the present, he found it almost amusing to recall his past. Woliang watched him from a corner, concern evident on her face. Eventually, overwhelmed by overtraining, he collapsed and lost consciousness. She rushed to carry him inside. Though his body had failed him, he remained faintly aware and noted with surprise that Woliang was stronger than she appeared. The following day, despite heavy rain, Mumyong continued training. The group of bullies appeared once more. One complained that the prince had come again and remarked that he was persistent even in such weather. The leader begrudgingly handed over a bag of money, having lost another bet. He was mockingly addressed as Nungrio, and someone remarked that he had lost again because he always wagered that the young master would not show up. Nungrio glared at Mumyong with hostility and shouted in irritation, questioning why he was acting that way and complaining that it was pathetic for him to pretend to train now. One companion cautioned him to lower his voice, warning that the prince might hear. Nungrio dismissed the concern, retorting that it did not matter as the young master had already lost his title and been expelled from his quarters. He asserted that even if that deadbeat became patriarch, he would wield no real authority. When asked what he meant, Nungrio explained that the Council of Elders existed, and above all, Unit Commander Cheon Sianhak would never obey the eldest young master's orders. Another agreed, and Nungrio elaborated that in the end, disciples would align themselves either with Commander Sianhak's armed forces or with the Council of Elders. Those were the only two viable paths. Frankly, even if the eldest young master ascended as patriarch, he would be powerless over them. Another companion urged him to stop accusing him of acting out merely because he had lost the bet. The group departed cheerfully, remarking that thanks to the eldest young master, they had made easy money again. Nungrio, however, continued glaring at the training prince with aggression, wondering irritably whether he believed that pretending to have come to his senses would restore his former title. Mumyong briefly stopped running, and Nungrio suspected that he had overheard everything, though he pretended otherwise. Woliang, who had been standing nearby holding fabrics, observed Nungrio with a serious expression, her disapproval clearly visible. The next morning at the training ground, Mumyong took a sword from the rack, lifting it with steady confidence. He tested its weight with measured swings. He concluded that he had built enough stamina to wield a blade properly. If he combined sword arts with his training, the absorption of the elixirs would accelerate even further. Suddenly, he heard Wuliang's voice demanding that someone take back what had been said. Turning toward the sound, he saw that the bullies had cornered her. She was shouting at them not to insult the young master. Surprised by her courage, Mumyong watched as Nungrio threatened her. She glared at him with intense disdain. Even Nungrio seized her by the collar. He, wearing an openly antagonistic expression, demanded to know what she had just said. Woliang, refusing to yield an inch, answered without hesitation that she had told him to retract his insult toward the young master. From the background, the other men mocked the unfolding confrontation, remarking that it seemed Nungrio had once again been bad-mouthing the grand young master, only this time the maid had overheard him. Amused and uninterested in intervening, they decided to leave the two behind and continue on their own. Nungrio shot Woliang a venomous glare and denounced her as insolent, demanding to know how a mere maid dared to speak to him in such a manner. Yet she did not even flinch in the face of his rage. Her unshaken composure only deepened his fury. Losing all restraint, he drew his sword and thought coldly that he would press the blade against her throat to see whether that arrogance would persist. Just as he moved to bring the steel to her neck, another blade flashed into existence, intercepting his strike at the final instant and hurling him backward. Stunned, Nungrio staggered and turned only to find Mumyong standing directly before Woliang, his sword leveled with unwavering precision. The sheer suddenness of Mumyong's appearance left Nungrio momentarily speechless. Mumyong ordered him to direct his sword toward him instead. Confusion flickered across Nungrio's face, but Mumyong continued, stating that if he had anything to say to Woliang, he should say it to him. Behind them, Woliang stood frozen in disbelief at the young master's words. Nungrio asked whether he was being challenged to a duel. Mumyong scoffed and replied that it need not be called a duel, perhaps it would be more fitting to call it a life or death match. He declared that if Nungrio won, he would not hold the incident against him, nor would he ever set foot in the training grounds again. He asked whether that was sufficient. Alarmed, Woliang attempted to stop him, thinking desperately that he had not even held a sword for the past month, and that this madness had to be halted. Yet Mumyong ignored her pleas. With deliberate resolve, he drove a wooden sword into the ground, marking the commencement of the duel. She was utterly stunned by the force and decisiveness of that gesture. With a contumacious expression, he reflected inwardly that he could endure insults directed at himself, but he would never tolerate insults aimed at someone who cared for him. As Woliang tried again to intervene, memories from his past life surfaced, reinforcing his conviction. He commanded Nungryo once more to raise his sword. Nungryo asked for his word. Mumiang assured him that he would not retract it. Seeing no retreat from this path, Nungryo assumed his stance and thought that although he had not expected such behavior from the Grand Young Master, there was no alternative now. The young master had sworn not to hold it against him if he won, so victory was all that mattered. Confident in his superior strength, speed, and swordsmanship, he convinced himself that the so-called scoundrel stood no chance. Suddenly an aura began to emanate from Mumiang's body, palpable and oppressive. Nungryo felt a flicker of genuine fear and wondered what that inexplicable spirit was. With a gaze burning in fury, Mumiang asked him why he was retreating in fear. As Nungryo stepped back instinctively, Mumiang declared that if he would not approach, then he would. He surged forward in a direct, unhesitating assault, his movement shockingly swift. Nungryo narrowly evaded the strike, and with a mocking glare thought that the attempt had been bold but too slow, that he could see through every motion. He questioned how someone of such perceived skill dared to issue a life-or-death challenge. However, the moment their blades met, an intense glow erupted at the point of contact, catching Nungryo completely off guard. The force of the impact sent his sword spiraling into the air. It descended and embedded itself into the ground before him. In the same breath, Mumiang's blade came to rest against his neck. Nungryo's eyes widened in absolute shock, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. He realized with dawning horror that Mumiang had never targeted him directly. His true aim had been the sword itself. When Nungryo had raised his weapon to block, Mumiang had redirected that very force to disarm him. He wondered whether the Cheon family even possessed such a technique, and when that despised scoundrel had grown so formidable. With his blade steady at Nungryo's throat, Mumiang reminded him that this had been declared a life-or-death match, yet he had swung his sword carelessly despite facing an opponent. He questioned whether that was truly what the Cheon family taught its disciples. Overwhelmed, Nungryo collapsed to his knees. Mumiang called him pathetic and turned away, holding his opponent's weapon. He declared that Nungryo did not deserve to wield that sword. Blood trickled from Mumiang's own hand, a silent testament to the sheer force he had exerted. He instructed Nungryo to reflect on why he wished to hold a sword at all, and when he found that answer, to seek him out again. Only then would he face him once more over that blade. Left kneeling, Nungryo remained in stunned reflection, his hand outstretched as though grasping for understanding. The other men stood in mute disbelief as Mumiang called for Woliang and departed with her, walking past the group without a second glance. As they returned to their quarters, Woliang suddenly fell to her knees, apologizing profusely. She confessed that she should not have stepped forward, explaining that when she heard them mocking his efforts, anger had overtaken her. Guilt weighed heavily upon her as she lamented that he had even injured his hand because of her, and that she should have maintained composure. Hearing her words, Mumiang reflected that the injury had resulted from employing a technique too advanced for his current body. It was not her fault, though there was no way he could explain such a truth. He told her she need not apologize at all, reminding her that she had stood up for him. She looked at him in astonishment as he continued, stating that he could endure insults aimed at himself, but he would never tolerate insults towards someone who cared for him. With a determined gaze and a faint smile, he vowed that to protect his people he would tolerate no such disrespect, regardless of who stood before him. Tears welled in Woliang's eyes as she was struck by the echo of an old New Year's wish from her childhood. She remembered the young Murim declaring that he would grow strong, become a family head as mighty as an elephant, and protect everyone. He had proclaimed that he would begin sword training the very next day, and had even promised to protect her despite her being taller at the time. Returning to the present, she wiped away tears of joy, convinced that the grand young master she once knew had returned. Their quiet moment was abruptly shattered by a furious voice demanding whether Mumiang could take responsibility for those words. Startled, Mumiang instinctively raised his sword, uncertain of the voice's origin. An imposing figure emerged, Muriang's uncle, one of the three pillars supporting the Cheon family, and the Grand Master of both the Heavenly Dragon Sword Corps and the Heavenly Phoenix Sword Corps, with unrestrained fury. The elder demanded once more whether Mumiang could bear responsibility for what he had said. He was Cheon Seonhak. Mumiang greeted him respectfully, admitting that he had been ignorant and had failed to pay his respects. Inwardly, he remembered that in his previous life, Seonhak had been the one he trusted and followed most, never imagining they would meet again under such strange circumstances. Seonhak dismissed the courtesies as pathetic, demanding a direct answer rather than half-hearted formalities. Mumiang observed the same cold disdain in his uncle's gaze that had existed 15 years prior, recalling how Seonhak had once declared the Grand Young Master beyond reform. Mumiang replied that as the Grand Young Master, he would never utter words he could not uphold. He affirmed that protecting his people was his conviction. Seonhak's fury intensified. He questioned how Mumiang dared to speak of protecting his people or of conviction, claiming that his mouth defiled such words. He then demanded to know about the sword technique used in the duel, the Heavenly Dragon Sword Dragon Claw. a secret art of the Heavenly Dragon Sword Corps, he asserted that since Mumyong was not a member of the Corps, he could not have learned it legitimately. Therefore, he must have acquired it from a traitor within the Corps, someone who cared about him and thus belonged among the people he claimed to protect. With choleric severity, Sianhak declared that he would uncover the traitor and punish them. Without mercy, anyone who sheltered such a person would suffer the same fate. He challenged Mumyong to attempt to protect them, as he had so boldly claimed. If he had failed, Sianhak would hold him accountable for the disturbance and ban him from the training grounds permanently. Mumyong understood that the Grand Master intended to exploit this incident as justification to expel him entirely, having long regarded him with distaste. Under the weight of his uncle's contemptuous glare, he recognized that his next words would determine everything, and thus he considered them with the utmost care. He met his uncle's gaze without flinching and declared that there had been no traitor. Sianhak was visibly shaken by the answer. Mumyong reflected inwardly that the one who had taught him had been none other than the Grand Master himself in his previous life. He then explained to his uncle that he had merely copied the Dragon Claw technique after witnessing it by chance. At those words, Sianhak let out a derisive, mocking laugh, while the Grand Master burst into loud amusement. Yet the mirth vanished as abruptly as it had begun. Sianhak's expression hardened. His face grew severe as he thundered that the claim was utterly ridiculous. In a surge of fury, he drew his sword, a formidable aura erupting from him. With eyes blazing crimson, he demanded how someone like Mumyong could possibly imitate such a technique after seeing it only once, and ordered him to draw his blade at once. Caught off guard, Mumyong felt tension coil within him. He had not anticipated such an escalation. A powerful red aura enveloped Sianhak, his glare fierce and appalled. Simultaneously anxious, yet faintly frustrated, Mumyong insisted that he had already spoken the truth. If disbelief persisted, he proposed that the Grand Master demonstrate another technique unfamiliar to him, promising that he would replicate that as well. Sianhak fell momentarily speechless. His sharp gaze shifted to Mumyong's injured hand, where blood began to drip steadily onto the ground. With evident disappointment, he accused him of continuing to lie merely to escape the moment, declaring that enough was enough, and that he could no longer trust a single word he uttered. Turning away, he called out to Wolyong, addressing her as the young master's maid. Terrified by the summons, she trembled as he demanded that she speak and reveal whatever scheme the scoundrel she served was plotting. With an infuriated glare, he warned that if she dared utter a lie, he would cut her down on the spot. Overwhelmed by fear, her hands shook as she replied that for the past month the young master had been smiling constantly. Sianhak stared at her in surprise and asked incredulously whether she meant that brat who had always erupted in anger from his inferiority complex. Still trembling, she affirmed his words and added that even while running laps around the training grounds, the Grand Young Master had continued to smile. As she spoke, Mumyong cast a sharp glance at her and realized that she had observed everything. With sincerity stirring within him, he reflected that for the first time in his life, he had been happy simply to work hard for himself. Wolyong continued explaining to the Grand Master that even when others sneered at him, he had not so much as glanced in their direction. In the past, he would have either flared up in anger or fled in humiliation. But this time he had done neither. Instead, for the first time, he had drawn his sword for her sake. With unwavering conviction, she declared that the young master had changed, and affirmed confidently that she believed in him. Confronted by the servant's passionate defense, Sianhak paused in contemplation and asked whether she truly meant that he had changed. He then turned to Mumyong and demanded to know which martial art he had mastered. Mumyong replied that he knew only the Heavenly Sun Divine Art. Sianhak observed that this made him no different from the other trainees. Raising 2 fingers, he imposed a deadline of 2 months to defeat the top trainee, declaring that only then would he attempt to believe him. Fixing him with a penetrating glare, he demanded to know whether he could accomplish it. Mumyong smiled inwardly, recalling how he had always been tested in such a manner. With calm confidence, he responded that 1 month would suffice. Sianhak regarded him with an unreadable expression before sheathing his sword, accepting the proposed deadline and departing. Mumyong also turned to leave, asking Wolyong to return with him, adding that he intended to run a little longer. She agreed happily. Half a month later, his steady hands gripped the sword hilt, revealing that he was no longer the same person. In a sudden burst of motion, he unleashed a powerful vertical strike, cleaving the air with violence and precision. Drenched in sweat from relentless training, he reflected that he had practically lived in the training grounds for the past fortnight, and had advanced to the 5th level of the Heavenly Sun Divine Art. Through that progress, he had nearly dissolved the yang energy within his body. Yet the yin energy distinct in nature from the Heavenly Sun Divine Art remained beyond his control. Gazing at his hand, he lamented inwardly that had he learned a higher cultivation method from the Heavenly Dragon Library, matters might have been different. Noticing that the wound on his hand had healed, he wished that his energy center might mend itself just as easily. While he was absorbed in thought, several apprentices mocked him, One remarked that he had been given a public opportunity to strike down the grand young master. Among them stood the foremost trainee, while other comments to lower their voices lest he overhear and flee before the match began. Another scoffed that it would make no difference, as all he did day and night was repeat downward strikes. A predictable end awaited him. Murimyong understood that the spreading rumors had likely been the Grand Master's intention to intimidate him into surrendering early, yet he betrayed no reaction. One of the men lounging in a chair sneered that perhaps the young master could not distinguish between hoeing a field and practicing sword forms. Laughter erupted around them. Unperturbed, Murimyong approached and inquired whether he was the top trainee. The man replied with a mocking smile that he was indeed, and assured him that he would conclude the match gently. Studying his face, Murimyong felt a flicker of recognition and asked for his name. The man introduced himself as Lee Suki. At the sound of that name, memory surged forth. Though his features appeared sharper, now Murimyong realized that this was the very man who had once leaked information about the Cheon family to the demon cult. Rage flared within him, his teeth grinding as he turned away and declared that he would remember the name. Suki responded sardonically that it was an honor, young master. As he departed, Murimyong reflected that he had originally intended simply to do his best regardless of his opponent. But that resolve shifted. With cold fury in his eyes, he vowed that Lee Suki would pay. Another half-month passed, and the day of the match arrived. Amid the gathered crowd, one spectator eagerly anticipated witnessing the grand young master's humiliating defeat. Another admitted that he seemed somewhat changed of late. Suddenly, the judge commanded absolute silence and announced the commencement of the long-awaited family event arranged by Grandmaster Cheon Seonhak. He summoned the challenger Lee Suki to step forward and called for Murimyong as well. Suki entered the arena with a confident smirk, sword raised, anticipating certain victory. The judge called out Murimyong's name once more, yet to everyone's astonishment, Murimyong was nowhere to be seen. Confusion spread as the judge stared toward the empty entrance. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. One voice suggested that he had not even come to the training grounds and had fled. Laughter followed, and Seonhak's expression darkened with disappointment, while Seoki's smirk deepened. Then a voice cut through the derision, declaring that Murimyong was already present. All eyes turned toward the speaker in shock. At that moment, Murimyong walked calmly into the arena prepared for battle. The crowd gasped in disbelief. One wondered where the pig had gone, while another asked who the unfamiliar figure was. Gradually, recognition dawned as whispers spread that the face seemed strangely familiar. The unrecognizable figure standing there, lean, composed, and confident, was none other than Murimyong himself transformed. With serene composure, he introduced himself as Cheon Murimyong and declared that he was ready to fight. He left the entire assembly speechless. Shock rippled outward like a silent tremor. Whispers spread through the crowd as they struggled to comprehend how he could have shed so much weight in so little time. It defied their sense of reason. Disregarding the murmuring spectators, he lifted his gaze toward his uncle, offered a respectful greeting, and apologized for his tardiness. Seonhak frowned. Impatience etched across his features, and brusquely told him to dispense with formalities, adding that he trusted he had come prepared. Without the slightest hesitation, Murimyong spun his wooden sword with effortless precision and declared that he was more than ready to accept the challenge. From a distance, Suki observed in silence, inwardly questioning the irritating confidence on his opponent's face. He wondered whether losing a bit of weight had inflated his courage. Deeming it absurd that someone who had swung a blade for merely a month would dare to confront him, his eyes drifted upward toward the stands where the authorities were seated, and he questioned what the Grand Master could possibly be thinking. Yet he conceded inwardly that the situation worked in his favor. Not only the Grand Master, but even the Heavenly Dragon Sword Captain and the Heavenly Phoenix Sword Captain were present, his expressions tinged with sardonic curiosity. Suki resolved to seize this opportunity to carve a lasting impression upon them. Observing Seoki's expression, Murimyong discerned that he had already been dismissed. He could almost hear the calculations unfolding behind that smirk, the scheming to curry favor with superiors. His gaze darkened as he reflected that Lee Suki was precisely the sort of man he remembered, a sly, festering parasite who clung to power by exploiting others. Memories surged unbidden. After Suki had entered the Heavenly Dragon Sword Corps, he had ascended not through the purity of his blade, but through insidious politics. With honeyed words and feigned loyalty, he had sold every fragment of information he could to the demonic cult, blinded by insatiable greed. The bitterness of that betrayal returned sharply. In his previous life, he had failed to pass judgment. Now, standing before his enemy once more, he acknowledged that Suki had not yet committed that crime. But that was precisely why he needed to be stopped before history repeated itself. Until now, everything had unfolded according to Seoki's design, enabling him to rise to the rank of top trainee. Murimyong allowed himself the faintest smile, thinking that it was unfortunate for Suki, for he knew him too well. Gripping his weapon with quiet resolve, he resolved that Seoki's ascent would end here. From above, Hak announced that the match would continue until he declared it finished, emphasizing that it was not a duel to the death. Hearing the conditions, Myung tightened his grip. His focus sharpened solely upon crushing his opponent. Suki, meanwhile, maintained an arrogant smile, confident that he would humiliate the so-called scoundrel with ease. Without further delay, Hak unleashed a commanding shout, signaling the commencement of the duel. Myung moved first, exploding forward in a blur of speed. The sudden charge caught Suki momentarily off guard. Myung soared high into the air. Siaki's expression turned malevolent as he recalled hearing that Myung had defeated Nungryo in a similar fashion, seizing the initiative and employing a peculiar technique to knock aside his opponent's blade. With a smirk, Suki raised his sword and inwardly challenged him to attempt the same maneuver again. As Myung descended to strike, Suki braced himself, silently daring him to deflect the blow. Their wooden swords collided with a resounding crack. To Myung's surprise, Suki successfully blocked the attack. A ferocious smile spread across Siaki's face as he retaliated. His wooden blade descended with terrifying pressure, cleaving through the air toward Myung. The impact was imminent. Forced into defense, Myung raised his weapon to absorb the crushing strength. Suki pressed his advantage relentlessly, attacking from behind as well. Yet Myung refused to remain static. With fluid agility, he slid aside and attempted to circle around for a counterattack. Even as he moved, Suki reflected that he had initially intended to show mercy for the dignity of the Grand Young Master. However, with so many high-ranking masters observing, he could not squander this chance. Driven by ambition, he unleashed his full strength, seizing Myung's hands. He reversed his wooden sword and struck brutally at his stomach. Myung gritted his teeth, struggling beneath the unexpected weight of the blow. Then Suki resorted to a dishonorable tactic, delivering a vicious kick to Myung's abdomen. The force sent him hurtling backward. Though he managed to regain his balance before collapsing entirely, Siaki's aura flared ominously. With a sinister expression, he instructed the Grand Young Master to watch closely, and lunged forward once more. Myung's eyes widened at the incoming strike. The blade hurtled toward him with terrifying velocity. In a split second, his sword fell from his grasp as Suki aimed for his shoulder. A sickening sound reverberated through the arena as the weapon struck his body. The pain was excruciating, and a cry escaped him. With smug satisfaction, Suki remarked upon the disparity in their levels as Myung dropped to his knees. Casting a glance toward the Grand Master, Suki reflected that it was unfortunate his opponent was someone like Myung, yet defeating him would suffice to demonstrate his own prowess. Raising his fist in triumph, he felt assured that events had unfolded precisely as anticipated. He looked down at his fallen opponent with a victorious smile. Then something felt amiss. The arena had fallen into an unnatural silence. He wondered why he could hear nothing at all. In the next instant, he noticed something profoundly strange. The training ground appeared tilted as though lying on its side. Disoriented, he blinked repeatedly, but the sensation of confusion overwhelmed him. Footsteps thudded firmly against the ground beside his face. Turning his head with difficulty, he saw Myung standing over him. Confusion seized him. Why was Myung upright while he himself lay prone? Myung offered a faint mocking smile, and calmly inquired whether he had enjoyed his brief nap. Suki struggled to process the situation. Drool slipped from the corner of his mouth as he questioned why he was on the ground, why his body refused to respond. Something nearby caught his eye. His gaze widened in horror as he saw his shattered wooden sword. Memory returned in a violent rush. When Myung had leapt into the air to strike, the force of his counterattack had been overwhelming. Rather than retreating, Myung had advanced, turning Siaki's own strength against him. The impact had splintered Siaki's sword in a single decisive blow. In one seamless motion, Myung had driven the hilt of the broken blade into Siaki's forehead. The sheer violence of the strike had rendered him unconscious before he struck the ground. Now back in the present, Suki lay defeated, stunned that he had fallen to someone he had so thoroughly underestimated. Myung regarded him coldly, and whispered that he was a potential traitor. Suki, unable to hear clearly, wondered what he had just been called. Myung informed him that he would be spared for the moment, but warned him to watch his conduct carefully, adding that he would be observing him from now on. Suki rationalized that he had merely let his guard slip, that anyone would falter against a supposedly insignificant opponent who had trained only a few months. Yet as he gazed at Myung, a darker realization crept in. His reputation was in ruins. The crowd erupted into stunned murmurs. One voice questioned whether the match had already ended. Another echoed in disbelief that it had concluded in a single move. Others confirmed that it had indeed been decided in one strike. Meanwhile, Wolyang could no longer restrain her emotions. Tears streamed down her face, tears of overwhelming relief and joy at her master's safety and victory. Myung ignored the swelling uproar and turned his gaze toward the tower where the Grand Master sat. Hak grunted, his expression a complex blend of surprise and irritation. The breeze stirred Mumyang's garments as he stood tall within the arena, quiet confidence radiating from his bearing. Sianhak returned his stare without uttering a word. The crowd descended into fervent speculation, debating whether the top trainee had truly fallen in a single strike, or whether some hidden trick had been employed. Among them, one man clenched his fist, struggling to suppress his frustration. He reflected bitterly that the fool had squandered a perfect opportunity to expel that scoundrel from the training grounds. Grinding his teeth in indignation, he found Mumyang's victory utterly intolerably infuriating. With an imposing voice, Sianhak stepped forward, preparing to announce the official outcome of the match and proclaim the true victor. Before he could finish, however, a loud voice abruptly cut across the training ground. "I need to say something." All eyes immediately turned as Mumyang stepped forward, raising his voice so that everyone present could hear him clearly. He openly confessed that the wrongs he had committed in the past could never be concealed or erased. He admitted everything without excuse, declaring that he had indeed been a deadbeat, a piece of trash. The unexpected confession left the trainees stunned. Even Sianhak, who had been ready to continue speaking, fell silent. Nearby, Woliang gazed at Mumyang with unmistakable concern reflected in her eyes. Inside, Mumyang clenched his fists tightly. He reflected bitterly that he could not even remember all the faces of those he had wronged. Those sins had originally belonged to Cheon Muriang, not the person he once had been. Yet he had taken over Muriang's body, and with it came the burden of every mistake tied to that name. Nevertheless, he resolved that he would bear the price of those sins. From that moment onward, he accepted the responsibility completely. He declared inwardly that he was Cheon Muriang. Raising his head, he spoke again, his voice firm and unwavering. He stated that here and now he wished to apologize for every eccentricity and evil deed he had committed. With that, he bowed. It was not a shallow gesture. Instead, he bent into a deep formal bow, one that carried the unmistakable weight of genuine remorse. A heavy silence descended upon the training ground. The trainees exchanged bewildered glances, unable to comprehend the sudden transformation in Muriang's conduct. Meanwhile, Woliang continued holding the heavenly light sword that she had been safeguarding for him. Her heart pounded as she watched him. The man standing before everyone now felt entirely different from the person she had known before. From above, Sianhak observed the scene in silence. He no longer saw Muriang as the foolish boy he had once despised. Instead, he saw a genuine martial artist standing proudly on the training ground. Muriang straightened his posture and addressed the trainees once more. He told them that if their anger had not yet subsided, they were welcome to come to the training ground at any time, because he would be there. Having made his declaration, he turned his back on the stunned crowd. He calmly thanked his uncle before walking away. Then he glanced toward Woliang and told her that it was time for them to leave. Sianhak could only watch as he departed. After some time had passed, and they had walked away from the training ground, Muriang spoke again. He thanked Woliang for holding the heavenly light sword for him, explaining that he had prepared it in case the situation had escalated into a genuine sword duel. Woliang carefully held the sword as she responded. She told him that it was nothing. She admitted that she had been extremely nervous, but holding the sword had somehow given her strength. In fact, she confessed that it had felt good. Muriang offered a faint smile. He replied that he was glad to hear that. Then he extended his hand. He asked her to return the sword, saying that he would carry it himself. However, when he requested the weapon, Woliang hesitated. For reasons she could not easily explain, she seemed reluctant to let go of it. Muriang frowned slightly, puzzled by her reaction. Holding the sword close to her face, Woliang spoke with an enraptured expression. She asked if she could continue holding it a little longer. Her gaze lingered gently on the blade. She admitted that she needed Sokian for a little while longer. Before Muriang could respond, another voice suddenly interrupted them. A man asked what exactly he had intended to cut. Startled, Muriang immediately turned around. Standing behind them was Sianhak. Muriang could not help but think that he never expected to hear those words again. Sianhak stared at him with sharp, penetrating eyes. He referred to the sword technique Muriang had displayed earlier and demanded to know what he had truly intended to cut. Muriang answered without hesitation. He said that he had intended to cut the sky. His expression remained calm, yet his confidence was unmistakable. He repeated that his goal had been to cut the sky. Sianhak's eyes widened slightly. Lowering his gaze, he pondered the statement silently. He thought to himself that the idea sounded utterly ridiculous. And yet, that very concept, the notion of cutting the sky, was the path of the sword that he himself had pursued for his entire life. Ironically, the one who had grasped that path first was the person he had despised the most. Still, the outcome of the duel was undeniable. Sianhak lifted his gaze toward Muriang once again. He acknowledged that Muriang had won the match and told him to state his request, promising that he would grant it. Muriang answered immediately. He asked for permission to enter the Heavenly Dragon Library. Sian Hak refused without the slightest hesitation. He stated firmly that anything but that request could be granted. The matter was beyond his authority. Murim paused briefly, considering his options before speaking again. He then requested that one person be assigned every day to duel with him. Sian Hak raised an eyebrow. He asked whether daily duels alone would truly suffice. Murim confirmed that it would be enough. In truth, he had already made up his mind. He knew that there was no training more effective than real combat. Sian Hak studied him silently before turning away. He remarked that Murim would grow stronger with each passing day. Murim replied that this was precisely what he hoped for. Without another word, Sian Hak departed. Once he had left, Woliang turned toward Murim. She asked what he had meant by cutting the sky. Murim answered casually. He explained that it was something known only to the general commander and himself. The following day, a man stepped forward with such force that the ground beneath his feet cracked, sending fragments of debris scattering through the air. The other trainees immediately moved aside. The man radiated pure frustration. He was Manhwa. He shouted angrily in disbelief at the arrangement that required someone to duel Murim every single day. Scoffing, he complained that Murim had gotten lucky once and was now behaving arrogantly. Manhwa began cursing Lee Suk-gu, who had been defeated by Murim. He remarked bitterly that he had already suspected something was wrong when that incompetent fool had strutted around as if he were the head disciple. Suddenly, he stopped. An unsettling realization surfaced in his mind. In truth, this duel arrangement might actually be even better. Slowly, he unsheathed his sword. The polished blade reflected his face, and along with it resurfaced a memory he had never been able to forget. Years ago, outside a tavern, a drunken voice had once shouted arrogantly. He demanded to know whether the poor man understood who he was. Inside the tavern, a heavily intoxicated and belligerent Cheon Murim had been yelling at a trembling man. He had loudly boasted that he was the eldest young master of the Cheon clan, demanding respect and obedience. Several trainees had been watching from a distance, unwilling to involve themselves. One of them had whispered quietly that thanks to that wealthy novice they had finally managed to visit a high-class tavern, yet that useless deadbeat had appeared and ruined everything. Another had asked nervously whether they should simply leave. Among them had sat a young Manhwa, his face still unscarred. One of his companions had whispered urgently, warning him not to look at Murim lest he get dragged into trouble. But Manhwa had slowly risen from his seat. He had calmly remarked that someone ought to stop the young master, because at this rate the man might actually kill someone. His friend had tried desperately to stop him, but it had already been too late. When the drunken Murim had raised his fan to strike the helpless man, Manhwa had stepped forward. He rushed forward to block the blow. Sparks had burst into the air. During the clash, Manhwa's face had been cut. Blood had spilled from the wound. Yet he had remained standing, bleeding but unyielding. The old Murim had sneered at him mockingly. He had scornfully asked who Manhwa thought he was, and why he had dared to stand in his way, remarking that it was no surprise he had gotten hurt. Manhwa had remained silent, his expression burning with indignation. Noticing the blood on his face, Murim had simply scoffed. He had mockingly wondered whether the man was attempting to stage some kind of scam. With a dismissive wave, he had told him that it would not work and ordered him to get lost. The memory faded. Back in the present, Manhwa stared at his reflection in the blade. His expression twisted with cold determination. He murmured that just as Murim had once left a scar on his face, he would return the favor and carve the same scar onto Murim's. Slowly tightening his grip on the sword, he was the first opponent in Murim's daily duels. Under the blazing sun of the training grounds, Cheon Murim moved like a blade granted human form. He leapt into the air and brought his sword crashing downward, unleashing a violent surge of force that slammed into the courtyard below. Again and again he repeated the sequence: jump, descend, strike. Each motion remained crisp, controlled, and indistinguishable from the last. Then while still airborne he thrust forward in a sharp aerial attack, driving the tip of his sword toward an imaginary opponent with relentless focus and frightening speed. From a distance, Manhwa stood watching. His jaw tightened as irritation simmered in his chest. Inwardly he cursed the man before him as a worthless bastard. It was Murim who had demanded this duel, yet someone had already arrived, and he would not even spare a glance. Manhwa's gaze hardened. If that was how things would be, then so be it. He resolved to prepare himself. After all, this would be a life and death duel fought with real swords. Just then Woliang approached quietly, carrying a tray with a teapot and cups, and gently informed him that he should have some tea while he waited, explaining that it might take a little while. Once the young master began training, she added, he lost all awareness of his surroundings, mentioning that refreshments were also available and asking whether he would like anything. Manhwa studied her more closely. He wondered if this was the personal maid rumored to have clashed with Nungrio. Curtly he declined, saying that he had a duel soon. Yet despite his refusal he accepted the tea she had already poured. With a skeptical expression he asked whether the young master trained like this every day. Liang answered without hesitation that he did not miss a single day. As her gaze drifted toward the training grounds, a faint smile touched her lips and a soft warmth illuminated her expression. She quietly remarked that it was good the young master had become dedicated to training now unlike before, though she admitted she sometimes worried he might be pushing himself too hard. At those words Manhwa's eyes narrowed. Sharply he asked whether the eldest young master had not tormented her quite a bit, and questioned why she cared about him so much. Liang lowered her gaze, though her voice remained steady. She acknowledged that the young master had certainly made many mistakes in the past, but insisted that he had changed. He was working hard to correct the wrongs he had committed, she explained, and she believed in the sincerity of his efforts. Manhwa sipped his tea while pondering her words, righting his wrongs. He glanced back toward Murim. He could not deny that the eldest young master had changed recently. With an indignant expression, he continued watching the training. The man truly was training hard. At first glance it appeared simple. Murim merely repeated the same jump and downward slash over and over again. But suddenly Manhwa's eyes widened. Something was wrong. The position of Murim's landing foot, the precise height of the descending blade, even the exact angle of his grip on the hilt. Every detail was identical each time. How could that deadbeat young master possess such precise swordsmanship? A dreadful thought crept into Manhwa's mind. As he stared at the figure training before him, the scene seemed to distort. In his mind's eye, the descending strike was no longer aimed at the ground. It was aimed directly at him. Murim's sword came crashing down toward his throat. The blade stopped just short of his neck. Yet the phantom pressure of killing intent felt terrifyingly real. Cold sweat drenched Manhwa's back, as though he had truly faced that strike. He gasped inwardly in disbelief. This was impossible. He had not even stepped into the arena yet. A chilling suspicion seized him. Had Murim been directing his sword at him the entire time? At that moment Murim finished his training and began walking over. He approached calmly and inclined his head slightly. He apologized for making Manhwa wait, and remarked that it was good to see him. Manhwa blinked in surprise. He asked whether Murim knew his name. Murim replied casually that he did, explaining that Manhwa would one day become an official warrior of the clan and that he was trying to memorize the names of everyone. Manhwa froze. Everyone. Every trainee in the clan. Murim's gaze then drifted toward the scar on Manhwa's blade. Thoughtfully he observed that the mark was no ordinary scar and wondered aloud whether he himself had caused it. Manhwa answered simply that he had. Understanding dawned in Murim's eyes. That must explain the killing intent he had occasionally sensed from Manhwa. It must have been something the old Cheon Murim had done. Slowly and deliberately Murim sheathed his sword. Then he bowed deeply. With sincere remorse he apologized, admitting that his foolish mistake had left Manhwa with an indelible scar and that he could not undo what had already been done. He respectfully asked for forgiveness. The air seemed to freeze. Manhwa's thoughts spiraled. Had the young master truly just apologized to him? The eldest young master he had known would never admit fault. He would have blamed others, perhaps even insulted them. That was the man Cheon Murim used to be. Yet now the young master stood before him with his head bowed. Manhwa wondered whether this was truly the same person. Slowly he placed his teacup back onto the tray. Then he stated that he admitted defeat. He turned and began walking away. Murim blinked in surprise and pointed out that the duel had not even begun yet. Without stopping, Manhwa replied over his shoulder that he had already lost today. He added firmly that next time he would prepare properly and challenge him again, addressing him respectfully as young master. With that he left. Even Liang stood frozen, stunned by what had just transpired. Murim simply watched him depart with a small smile, believing his apology had been accepted, but Liang sensed something different. In Manhwa's eye she had not seen friendliness. She had seen fierce resolve. Soon afterward Murim turned to her. He told Liang that he had a favor to ask. She answered respectfully, asking what he needed. He instructed her to write down a list of all his past misdeeds. Her eyes widened slightly. He told her not to leave anything out and insisted that if he had ever wronged her personally, she should write that down as well. Nothing was to be hidden. Liang hesitated, concern crossing her face. Still she nodded and said she understood. Murim lifted his gaze toward the sky. Righting his wrongs, he reflected, was where he needed to begin. It was a burden he had to carry as Cheon Murim. From the following day onward, the duels began. Each day challengers arrived fueled by resentment. One shouted that this was Murim's karma and warned him not to blame others for what would happen. But the moment the duel began, Murim leapt into the air and brought his blade crashing down. The sheer force of the strike knocked his opponent flat to the ground. Every match ended in a single exchange. Yet afterward Murim would extend a hand to the fallen opponent and help them to their feet. Calmly he would suggest that they spar again sometime. Most challengers were defeated with a single strike. No one could overcome him. Meanwhile, Liang stood nearby, carefully recording the results of each duel, every victory and defeat. Curiously, she often glared irritably at the defeated challengers, clearly annoyed by the young master's kindness toward people who had come seeking revenge. Despite the relentless stream of challengers, Cheon Muriang remained undefeated until the final day of the duels. Early one morning he sat beside the window of his room immersed in deep meditation. His internal energy circulated steadily throughout his body. He had already reached the 7th stage of the heavenly yang divine art. Yet one obstacle remained. He still could not melt the Yin energy. That Yin energy obstructed the Ren and Du meridians, the primary pathways leading to the Dantian, disrupting the natural flow of qi. Because of this blockage, he could not access the vast energy stored within his Dantian. If he forced the process, he knew grimly that his meridians would burst and he would suffer qi deviation. A faint glimmer flashed in his eyes. This, he realized, was the limit of the heavenly yang divine art. It was only a basic yang cultivation technique. His only option now was to enter the Heavenly Dragon Library and learn a higher-tier cultivation method. When he emerged from meditation, however, an uneasy feeling lingered. Something felt wrong. It seemed as though he had forgotten something important. Then, realization struck him. The patriarch would return today. Muriang immediately began preparing to visit him. He thought warmly of the benefactor who had taken him in when he had nowhere else to go. He looked forward to seeing him again. Dressed in formal robes and carrying his sword, Muriang paused briefly. He supposed he should call the man father. It was something he had once dreamed of long ago. Before he could dwell on the thought, any further frantic shouting erupted outside. Muriang turned toward the noise just as a maid came running toward him in panic. Recognizing her, he asked whether she was Wahong, Wuliang's friend. Her face was pale with fear. She cried out urgently that Wuliang was in serious trouble. Muriang's expression darkened immediately as he demanded to know what had happened. Wahong explained breathlessly that Wuliang was currently with the woman rumored to be his fiancée. Shock flashed through his eyes. Elsewhere within the residence, a dish of food crashed loudly onto the floor. Wuliang knelt on the ground, trembling as she bowed repeatedly while apologizing over and over again. Standing before her was an imperious woman clad in elaborate white garments now stained with splashes of sauce. Her beautiful face was twisted with cold disdain as she looked down upon the trembling maid. The courtyard sank into a suffocating silence. Behind her, the guards loomed like oppressive shadows, their mere presence stifling the air. At the center of it all, Wuliang knelt upon the frigid stone, her body trembling uncontrollably as fear coiled around her like unbreakable chains. Her head remained bowed, her hands pressed weakly against the ground, as though even the earth itself might reject her existence. Before her stood the lady. She gazed down with undisguised disdain, her expression obscured behind a delicately poised fan. In a voice devoid of warmth, she remarked that clothes once stained could not be cleansed by something as trivial as an apology. Her tone was too composed, as if the situation amounted to nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Without sparing another glance, she issued a casual order for the matter to be handled in accordance with the law, then turned away as though the outcome were already beneath her concern. At once a lead warrior stepped forward. Steel whispered sharply as his blade slid free from its sheath. Without hesitation, he raised the sword, its cold gleam hovering mere inches above Wuliang's exposed neck. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming unchecked as her entire body quaked in helpless terror. Then a voice shattered the stillness. Wahong burst into the courtyard, her desperate cry ringing through the air as she screamed for them to stop. Yet the executioner did not falter. The blade descended with unrelenting intent. Clang! A violent collision of steel exploded through the courtyard. The sword halted mere inches from Wuliang's throat. Shock rippled outward, freezing every onlooker in place. Standing at the threshold between life and death, Cheon Muriang held his sword firmly against the executioner's blade. His gaze burned with a chilling fury, his presence alone weighing heavily upon the atmosphere as he positioned himself protectively before Wuliang. The Tang clan warriors reacted instantly, drawing their weapons and encircling him without hesitation. Muriang's eyes swept across them, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade as he demanded an explanation for what was happening. At his intervention, Wuliang lifted her tear-filled gaze toward him, relief flooding her expression. The lady halted mid-step and turned back, her expression shifting into mild curiosity. With cool composure, she questioned the audacity of someone daring to interfere in the affairs of the Tang clan, asking his identity. Without the slightest hesitation, Muriang met her gaze and identified himself as Cheon Muriang, the eldest young master of the Cheon clan. At the sound of his name, several guards visibly stiffened. The woman's demeanor shifted instantly. A polite, yet faintly strained smile curved her lips as she introduced herself as Tang Sohai of the Sichuan Tang clan. The name struck him like a thunderclap. Tang Sohai. Memories surged violently from the depths of his past life. She had once been his wife, the Ice Flower. In that previous life, the patriarch of the Cheon clan had arranged a marriage alliance with the Tang clan. Convinced that their unparalleled mastery of poisons and antidotes could cure Muriang's ruined body ravaged by conflicting elixirs, The Tang clan had accepted eagerly, using the union as a calculated stepping stone to expand their influence into the Central Plains and Sohai. She had accepted it all without hesitation, even when their first meeting had proven utterly disappointing. The marriage had progressed with unsettling speed. Over the course of 10 years his condition had gradually improved, yet in exchange the Cheon clan had steadily weakened, exploited at every turn. The Tang clan had used them methodically, consolidating their dominance in Zhejiang. That marriage had marked the beginning of the Cheon clan's downfall. Returning to the present, Muriang's gaze turned glacial. With restrained fury sharpening his voice, he demanded to know what she thought she was doing. Sohai cast a brief dismissive glance at her stained garments and replied that she had merely been punishing a maid who had dirtied them. His expression darkened further. He questioned whether she had truly intended to kill a Cheon clan maid over such a trivial matter. She responded with a faint scoff, remarking that it seemed the eldest young master saw only a maid. Failing to recognize the value of what had been ruined, her tone sharpened as she elaborated, suggesting that the substance could just as easily have been poison or that the girl herself might have been an assassin in disguise. Lowering her fan slightly, she revealed the faint curl of a calculating smile, asserting that the Tang clan had its own laws and that the punishment was entirely justified under them. Muriang snapped back, rejecting her reasoning outright. He stated firmly that this was not Tang clan territory and that within the Cheon clan their laws prevailed. His voice rang across the courtyard as he declared that her words were an insult not only to his clan but to his people. Sohai's smile thinned into something colder. She countered that it was he who insulted the Tang clan's authority, questioning whether he truly believed they relinquished their laws simply by stepping onto Cheon territory. Her gaze sharpened into a direct challenge as she declared that the Tang clan would enforce its laws regardless, and if he believed he could stop them, he was free to try. At her subtle signal, the lead guard stepped forward. The instant his blade was drawn, a menacing aura erupted from him. Sword chi. Muriang's eyes narrowed sharply as the guard lunged, his weapon blazing with lethal energy. The clash was immediate. Muriang met the strike head-on, but the impact sent a violent shock coursing through his arms. The guard pressed relentlessly, each successive blow heavier than the last, forcing Muriang steadily onto the defensive. Sohai observed the maid, whose anxious concern for the young master was evident. With a distinctly irritated expression, she then proceeded to take a poison needle. Around them the courtyard descended into chaos. Steel collided in rapid succession, sparks scattering with every exchange. Though their techniques appeared evenly matched, the disparity in raw power was unmistakable. Muriang gritted his teeth, recognizing the truth. The opponent was formidable, a direct escort capable of wielding sword chi, at least first-rate. Their swordsmanship might be equal, but in both internal and external energy, he was completely outmatched. For a brief moment, the two disengaged. Then Muriang shifted. Abandoning brute force, he altered his stance, his movements becoming precise and controlled. Techniques from his past life surfaced instinctively, guiding him. In a sudden burst of motion, he surged forward, not toward the man, but toward the sword itself. Leaping high, he struck at the precise moment the blade entered his range. His hands moved like lightning. He invoked the Heavenly Dragon Sword unit, executing the technique known as Dragon Claw Rain. With astonishing precision, he seized control of the flow of energy, redirecting the guard's sword chi. Sparks erupted violently. The deflected force slammed into the stone courtyard, shattering it upon impact. The guard's eyes widened in disbelief. His strongest attack had been completely nullified, and yet Muriang's sword lay discarded on the ground. The guard stepped forward, a smirk forming as he remarked that he had expected something far more impressive. Muriang clenched his teeth, fury igniting within him as he acknowledged the harsh reality. The gap in internal power was simply too vast. Even that technique had not been enough. Before the battle could resume, Sohai's voice cut cleanly through the tension. She approached with unhurried grace, faint amusement lingering in her gaze. She remarked that she had not expected her fiancé to care so deeply for a mere maid, and that curiosity had drawn her there to witness it herself. As she passed him, she added softly that she would see him at the banquet that evening, suggesting that he try to be a little more gentle when that time came. Muriang offered no response. He merely watched her with an unyielding, frigid glare as she departed. Then, a trembling voice broke through the silence. While Hong called out urgently, Muriang turned at once. Woliang had collapsed. She lay motionless upon the ground. From a distance, Sohai observed the scene, her fan concealing a faint calculating smile. She noted inwardly that the eldest young master was not as weak as rumors had suggested. Her eyes narrowed slightly. If the patriarch were to realize this truth, the marriage might not proceed. That possibility was unacceptable. Turning to the guard who had fought Muriang, she inquired about his assessment. The man reported respectfully, stating that Muriang was weak, his swordsmanship passable, but his internal power lacking, and that 2 of his subordinates would suffice to handle him. Sohai's expression hardened. She issued a cold, decisive command to mobilize. 4. Her voice dropped to a chilling whisper as she instructed them to ensure that the eldest young master did not appear at the banquet that night. Panic surged through Muryang's face as he rushed to Wolyang's side. Her complexion was deathly pale, her breathing barely perceptible. Poison. His gaze snapped toward the spilled meal nearby. A memory surfaced. Her bright, cheerful voice from earlier that day enthusiastically assuring him that she would bring the meal herself, promising that it would not be mushrooms this time. Rage surged through him. With careful urgency, he lifted her into his arms. In a tight, controlled voice, he instructed Wahong to take care of his sword. Without waiting for a reply, he carried Wolyang away, every step driven by urgency. Hidden behind a pillar, an unseen observer watched the entire exchange unfold, unease creeping steadily into his thoughts. Something was deeply wrong. He resolved to inform Nungrio.